In this episode, we reach a very important point in the governance process. The moment when an organization has already selected an artificial intelligence, AI, system and now has to decide whether that specific system should actually be deployed. For a beginner, this is where responsible decision-making becomes much more concrete, because the conversation is no longer about broad possibilities or general categories of tools. It is about one chosen system, one intended use case, one operating environment, and one real set of people who may benefit from or be affected by what the system does after launch. That is why focused impact reviews matter so much before deployment. They help the organization slow down and ask whether this particular system, in this particular setting, creates a pattern of benefit, risk, and obligation that remains acceptable once the system leaves controlled evaluation and starts influencing real work, real judgments, and sometimes real opportunities for human beings. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A focused impact review is different from a broad, early-stage impact assessment, even though the two ideas are related. Earlier in the life of a project, an organization may study a proposed use case at a high level to decide whether it should even be explored, what kinds of risk may exist, and what questions must be answered before development continues. A focused impact review happens later, after a system has been chosen and often after testing, refinement, and planning have already narrowed the field. At that point, the goal is not to talk about hypothetical AI in general. The goal is to examine the selected system with enough precision to judge whether the deployment makes sense in the real environment now being planned. For a beginner, this distinction matters because governance becomes much stronger when it gets more specific over time. Early reviews ask whether the project deserves attention at all, but focused reviews ask whether the chosen system deserves release under defined conditions rather than under abstract hopes. The word focused is especially important here because many organizations fail when they rely on broad and comfortable language instead of precise analysis. A vague review might say the system helps efficiency, improves consistency, or supports decision-making, but those claims are too soft to support a real deployment decision. A focused impact review asks narrower and more useful questions. What exact task will the system perform, and where in the workflow will that task take place? Who will use it? Who may be affected by it? And what happens if the system is wrong in ordinary cases, edge cases, or unusual periods of stress? Beginners should notice that this kind of review does not exist to slow everything down for its own sake. It exists because vague benefits and vague risks produce weak governance, while precise benefits and precise risks create the kind of evidence leaders need if they later have to explain why they approved the system, what protections were supposed to exist, and what trade-offs they knowingly accepted. One of the first things a focused impact review should do is define the deployment scenario in operational terms rather than marketing terms. It should describe where the system will sit in the workflow, what information it will receive, what kind of output it will produce, how often it will be used, how much people are expected to rely on it, and what human actions will follow its output. This matters because the same system can look very different depending on how it is actually used. A system that offers a draft for later human editing is not the same as a system whose ranking or recommendation quietly determines which cases get attention first. For a beginner, the lesson is that deployment decisions should never be based only on the label attached to the tool. Saying that a system is an assistant, a support tool, or a productivity enhancer does not explain its real influence. A focused review reveals that influence by studying the system at the level where actual consequences will appear once the deployment begins. After the deployment scenario is clear, the organization needs to identify the people and groups who may be affected directly or indirectly. Sometimes the direct users are employees, analysts, or reviewers, but the people affected most seriously may be customers, applicants, patients, students, citizens, or others who never touch the system themselves. That distinction is essential because organizations sometimes evaluate impact too narrowly and focus only on internal convenience. A tool that saves staff time may still create unfairness, opacity, delay, or confusion for the people on the receiving end of decisions shaped by that tool. A focused impact review should therefore look beyond the immediate operator and ask who bears the consequences of error, misunderstanding, or over-reliance. For a beginner, this expands the idea of governance in a useful way. Responsible review is not only about whether the organization likes the system. It is also about whether the system changes the experience, opportunity, or treatment of others in ways that are proportionate, explainable, and defensible before deployment moves forward. A strong, focused review also examines the seriousness of the decision environment. Some AI deployments support low-stakes work where mistakes are inconvenient but easy to correct. Other deployments influence access to resources, affect reputation, shape safety decisions, or create outcomes that are difficult for a person to reverse once the system's output has been acted upon. The seriousness of that environment changes the standard the organization should apply before deployment. A model that is good enough for internal drafting may be nowhere near good enough for prioritizing sensitive cases or shaping judgments about people under time pressure. Beginners should understand that there is no universal threshold for readiness that fits every use case. The acceptable level of uncertainty depends heavily on what is at stake, how visible errors will be, whether those errors can be challenged, and whether those affected by the system will have meaningful recourse if something goes wrong after deployment. Business benefit still matters inside a focused impact review, but benefit has to be examined carefully rather than accepted as a slogan. The organization should ask what exact value the selected system is supposed to provide and how that value will be measured after deployment. Is the goal faster handling of routine work, more consistent treatment of repetitive cases, reduced manual burden, improved access to information, or something else entirely? Just as important, the review should ask whether that benefit is meaningful enough to justify the risks, controls, and operational burden that will follow. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest signs of mature governance. The organization is not treating AI as valuable simply because it is modern or impressive. It is asking whether the selected system solves a real problem in a way that is worth the new exposure it creates. A deployment that offers only marginal convenience may not deserve approval if the review reveals significant ethical, legal, or operational concerns that would be difficult to manage later. Ethical analysis should also become more specific at this stage. Earlier in a project, ethics discussions may stay broad and principle-based, but once a system has been selected, the review should ask concrete questions about fairness, transparency, dignity, and dependence. Could the selected system produce systematically weaker outcomes for certain groups because of how it was trained or how it will be used? Could the workflow pressure people into accepting automated output without real understanding or meaningful challenge? Could the deployment reduce human attention where empathy, discretion, or contextual judgment still matter greatly? For a beginner, the value of a focused review is that it turns ethical concern into practical judgment. Instead of saying fairness matters in general, the organization studies whether this system, in this role, under these conditions, creates patterns that may disadvantage people or limit their ability to understand and respond to decisions that shape their lives or opportunities. Data deserves close attention in a focused impact review because the system that looked acceptable during selection may rely on data conditions that do not hold up in production. The organization should ask whether the live data expected after deployment matches the data used during evaluation closely enough to support confidence in the results. It should also examine whether important data may be missing, delayed, inconsistent, too narrow, or too messy once the system enters the real workflow. A selected system may appear strong in testing and still become fragile in practice if the production environment gives it less context, weaker signals, or more varied cases than the review team assumed. For a beginner, this is one of the easiest ways to see the difference between laboratory success and deployment readiness. A focused impact review does not just admire the evidence from development. It tests whether that evidence still deserves trust when the system is placed into the actual data environment where it will have to perform day after day. Human oversight must be evaluated with equal realism. Many organizations say a person remains in the loop, but a focused impact review should ask whether that statement is true in an operational sense rather than a formal sense. Do users have enough time to question outputs carefully, or are they under pressure to accept them quickly? Do they understand the system's limitations well enough to spot when it may be drifting, hallucinating, oversimplifying, or misreading context? Do they have authority to override the output, escalate concerns, or pause use when the system appears unreliable in a sensitive situation? Beginners should pay close attention to this because weak human oversight is one of the most common gaps between a promising plan and a poor deployment. If the real workflow makes thoughtful review unrealistic, then a focused impact review should not pretend that nominal human involvement solves the problem. It should name that weakness clearly and force the organization to decide whether stronger safeguards, narrower scope, or a different deployment approach is necessary before launch. Focused impact reviews should also look hard at downstream consequences, which means what happens after the system gives its output and people begin acting on it. Sometimes the immediate output seems modest, but the chain of consequences is much more significant than it first appears. A ranking may determine who gets reviewed first and who waits longer. A draft answer may shape how a customer is treated. A risk score may influence whether a person receives more scrutiny, less trust, or slower service. For a beginner, this is a powerful governance lesson because the true impact of a system often sits one or two steps beyond the model itself. The review, therefore, needs to trace the likely path from output to action to consequence and ask whether the organization is still comfortable defending the use of the system once that whole chain is visible. Many weak deployment decisions happen because teams assess the software alone and fail to study what ordinary employees, managers, or downstream systems will actually do with its output once it becomes part of daily operations. Another major purpose of a focused impact review is to identify conditions for deployment instead of treating approval as an all-or-nothing question. In some cases, the right answer will be that the selected system should not be deployed. In other cases, the review may show that deployment is acceptable only if the use case is narrowed, stronger monitoring is added, user training is improved, sensitive categories of cases are excluded, or human review requirements are made more robust and enforceable. This matters because good governance is not only about saying yes or no. It is also about defining the boundaries that make a conditional yes defensible. Beginners should understand that conditional deployment can be a sign of maturity rather than hesitation. The organization is using the review to shape a safer and more proportionate rollout instead of assuming that once a system is selected, full deployment must follow automatically. That habit creates room for pilot phases, guardrails, and explicit limits that reduce the chance of avoidable harm after release. Documentation is critical at this stage because the focused review should leave behind a clear record of what was examined, what risks were identified, what assumptions were tested, what safeguards were required, and why the final decision was considered acceptable or unacceptable. This documentation matters for accountability inside the organization, but it also matters later if incidents occur, if regulators or auditors ask questions, or if leadership changes and new decision-makers need to understand the reasoning behind the deployment. For a beginner, it helps to think of this record as the explanation the organization owes to its future self. Without it, a later team may not know why a particular restriction was imposed, why a certain use case was excluded, or why the system was approved only under specific operating conditions. Strong documentation turns the focused impact review from a discussion into an institutional memory that can support better monitoring, better audits, and better incident response once the system is live. A common misconception is that once a system has been selected, the hardest governance work is already over. In reality, selection is often the point where governance needs to become even more precise. Another misconception is that testing results alone can substitute for a focused review. Testing is essential, but it does not automatically answer questions about deployment context, affected groups, operational pressure, workforce readiness, or downstream consequences. A third misconception is that the review exists only for highly sensitive systems. Even moderate-risk deployments deserve focused review because small inefficiencies, mild bias, or subtle over-reliance can scale into meaningful organizational and human effects once a system becomes routine. For beginners, the larger lesson is that focused impact reviews are one of the main ways organizations convert technical promise into deployment judgment. They help leaders move from broad optimism to evidence-based approval by asking whether the selected system deserves real-world authority under the exact conditions in which it will be used. As we close, the most important idea is that a focused impact review gives an organization one final disciplined opportunity to study the chosen AI system before deployment in the exact context that will define its real significance. It clarifies the deployment scenario, identifies who may be affected, tests whether the business value is strong enough, examines ethical and data concerns, evaluates whether human oversight is realistic, traces downstream consequences, and sets conditions for release if the system is allowed to move forward. For a new learner, this is a powerful moment in governance because it shows that responsible deployment is never just about choosing a model and hoping for the best. It is about testing whether that chosen system, in that chosen role, inside that chosen workflow, remains proportionate, understandable, and defensible before it gains the power to influence real people and real outcomes. When organizations conduct focused impact reviews well, they do more than reduce risk. They make better, more accountable decisions about what deserves to enter the world and under what limits it should be allowed to operate.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.